All right, let's unpack all of that, the human and geopolitical layers of this moment and what this ceasefire could mean for the region's future. I'm joined now by Dr. Pedro Mzileni from the University of Zululand. Good afternoon. Thank you for your time. So this is a development long in the making, I suppose, in that there have been multiple efforts to try and secure a ceasefire in Gaza. How significant is it that we finally seem to be over the line with the movement that we are seeing of people trying to return to their devastated livelihoods in and around Gaza at the moment?
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. Well, I hardly get invited to come speak on mainstream media, so I hope you'll allow me a bit of time to disrupt mainstream thought this afternoon with a few insights rooted on knowledge. And I'll try to be less detailed and simplify as much as possible for you. Well, firstly, you'll have to understand the rules of the colonial battlefield. There are settlers and natives in the colonial battlefield. And this battlefield is designed by the settlers. In other words, the indigenous populations only begin natives at the arrival of the settlers, who then roll out colonial violence. Now, because this is colonial violence, Tulasism, in other words, the indigenous people of Palestine are made natives without their permission. They begin to resist the colonial violence because naturally they are human beings. The nature of the native resistance, therefore, is determined by the violence of the settlers. If the settler colonial project is intensive, armed, and drifting towards the death and the genocide of the native Tulasizwe, then the native resistance also becomes intensive and armed. So you've got to understand that there would not be a Hamas as part of the Palestinian resistance without the armed colonial settler violence of Israel, because we are precisely dealing here with a colonial situation. Not a civil misunderstanding or an earthquake, you know. It's a colonial battlefield. If that principle is clarified, then the terrain now where the violence is taking place, which is epistemic, targeting history and discourse to shape the future, will become more clear. And peace agreements and all kinds of playbooks that the colonial Israel settler project is playing, will become more clear.
So say a bit more then, with that historical context, important historical context you've just laid out. What are the implications for the ceasefire as it stands now, and some of the other plans that are meant to, back up that ceasefire and possibly lead to a lasting peace in the region, including the US president's 20-point plan for peace in the Middle East? How does the context you've painted sit alongside the current plan around the ceasefire, the broader plan, the 20-point peace plan that includes the disarming of Hamas, for example?
Well, the ceasefire peace deal is part of the playbook of the colonial project, right? It seeks to disarm Hamas, right? But most importantly, it seeks to plant on us a discourse of neutrality, right? In order to justify the mass killings, genocides, and land appropriations that have been taking place in Palestine, not since the 7th of October 2023. You have to go back to 1948, even go back to 1923, even go back all the way up to the 19th and the 15th century, So the United States, which is a modern empire after 1945, created by traditional empire, which was Europe before 1945, is declaring a peace ceasefire deal whilst during the night it arms Israel afterwards to kill children, to kill babies, to kill women, to kill scholars, to kill historians, to destroy schools, right? Even member states of the European Union, right? They go to the United Nations to claim that they recognize the state of Israel, but they claim to recognize the state of Palestine, but they arm Israel afterwards. So this is part of the whole colonial playbook. And the excuse being used is, oh no, Hamas is hiding in libraries, in hospitals, and in homes in Gaza, which is the very same method that was used by apartheid South Africa. Because you must understand, this is a global colonial project. Apartheid Israel is not disconnected from apartheid South Africa, right? So in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, the apartheid state invented the Suppression of Communism Act to basically arrest, kill, and bomb anyone who seeks to disengage with the apartheid state. And they went into people's homes, houses, and killing babies and school children to justify that they are looking for communists who are holding white people hostage. This is the very same playbook that they are using in Israel. But most importantly, if you allow me to say this point, on the discourse, violence, and complicity of the media, the SABC is also complicit in crimes, because you are a broadcaster that gives Zionists an audience to air their racist violence in the name of neutrality. You interview AfriForum fascists here and white liberal fascists like Helen Zille, and you do that because in South Africa there's a public culture of coloniality, where the deviances of white people and their racist violence is socially legislated as an opinion. Racism, Tula Sizwe, is not an opinion. And to broadcast as the SABC racism, it has no place there to do that. Violence, basically, racism is not an opinion. Racism is violence. Zionism is violence.
Okay.
And violence should not have an audience.
Dr. Mzileni, I do want to engage you on that point. I was about to wrap it up, but I do want to engage you on that point. I hear the point you're making about interviewing Zionists. That I hear, the point you're making. But in relation to the voices that are more domestic and political in nature, that have a constituency in this country, how would you suggest the SABC navigates that? The reality that we are the public broadcaster, no matter how you find their views disagreeable, they do have a constituency and we have a responsibility. So the names that you mentioned, your AfriForums, for example, your Helen Zille, for example, how would you have us navigate those waters that say, no matter how disagreeable you think their views are, we have a responsibility as a public broadcaster?
There is no neutrality in the colonial battlefield,
It's not about neutrality. It's not about neutrality. It's about an obligation in our constitutional democracy. Yes, you can.
Hear me out because I allowed you to talk, right? There's no neutrality between settler violence and the resistance of the native. There's no neutrality in the colonial battlefield, right? So what I'm trying to say, and please hear me out, right? As the SABC, understand that the racism is not an opinion to broadcast on the SABC. Racism is violence. And violence should not have an audience on the national broadcaster of a democratic and transformative South Africa. So if you interview Zionists who advance the killing of innocent people in Gaza, you are complicit on those crimes and you must be called out in order to do better, So that's the point I wanted to make, that apartheid, colonial, post-94 South Africa, and the coloniality being driven in Israel, in Gaza, these two things are not disconnected from each other. They are part of the same global project. And that is why South Africa, through progressive lawyers and activists like Mandla Mandela, are taking the fight in the international scene head on, because our freedom cannot be guaranteed without the freedom of the Palestinians.
And would you agree those voices are also being given a platform on the SABC?
No, because racism is not a voice. Racism is violence.
All right. Thank you for that. That's Dr. Pedro Mzileni from the University of Zululand.